Hello and welcome back to the IEA channel. Thanks for joining us on what is a pre-recorded version of the Definite article. I'm Emily Carver, I'm the media manager at the IEA. Today I'm joined by Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Mark Littlewood. We'll be discussing his latest column for The Times entitled "Sticking Plasters Will Not Revive the Economy, New Jobs Are Needed." You can find a link to Mark's column in the description box. If you're new to our channel, please do click the subscribe button and leave a comment giving your thoughts. So, Chancellor Rishi Sunak set out last week his mini budget, pumping another £30 billion into the economy in the way of consumer discounts, wage subsidies, and some tax breaks. At the heart of Sunak's statement were jobs, supporting them, creating them, and protecting them. It's clear the government is expecting unemployment to surge once the furlough scheme comes to an end, but the measures announced are aimed at keeping those job losses to a minimum. But are the measures announced merely delaying the inevitable by focusing on what Mark calls in his article sticking plaster measures? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hi Mark, thanks for joining me.
Hi Emily, good to speak to you.
How are you?
Very well, very well.
So in your article, you may come across as a little bit harsh. You refer to the measures set out by the Chancellor as sticking plasters. Surely the government is right to try and soften the blow for business after the furlough scheme inevitably comes to an end.
Well, I think the problem, you're right, Emily, I have been harsh in this article. I mean, it's my job as the director of a free market think tank to be harsh and to give, elected politicians no quarter and to criticise them harshly when I think they've got it wrong. Look, I've got some sympathy with the problem that Rishi Sunak and the government are trying to tackle here. We've basically shut down the economy, or vast swathes of it, for a period of time. What he's seeking to do is to make sure that businesses that would otherwise have been healthy and viable don't go to the wall and there aren't job losses because of short, but increasingly long interruption of normal service, right? So if a business would have gone bust and dozens of jobs would have been lost, perhaps thousands of jobs would have been lost just because of the economy closing down in April and May, well, perhaps the government needs to step in and provide a bridge to safe haven to actually make sure that that company can sort of spring back into life and get back to doing whatever it was doing previously when the lockdown fully ends. That's the concept behind it, and I kind of get that. My problem, however, is that too much of this plan, in my view, is about the things that you listed in your introduction, Emily. It's about protecting jobs and safeguarding them, I think you said, and possibly even having the government try to create jobs. And that might delay when the recession hits. It might even smooth it out a bit, which rather than sort of suddenly millions of people being made redundant on a single day. But I don't think that's the biggest problem. The biggest problem is going to be when loads of companies fold and fail, which will happen inevitably now. And when loads and loads of people find themselves out of work, I'm not sure of the exact number, but it could be millions. What is the best mechanism for them finding new jobs, new employers, or people setting up new businesses that can grow and employ people? And although I appreciate the government's in a crisis and sort of needs to get through the day to day and doesn't want the tsunami to hit tomorrow or the next day, it is a bit of kicking the can down the road here, because I think that many of the measures that Rishi Sunak announced are just going to delay the inevitable. There's an awful lot of throwing a vast amount of mud at the wall, and I don't think much of it will stick. On the margins it will, but it's a colossal program that I think is going to make very limited long-term difference to salaries, employment levels and business viability in the UK.
Of course, we are where we are, but looking back, do you think that businesses may well have innovated and adjusted their business models were it not for the government's various support schemes, the furlough scheme, and now we also have the job retention bonus? So it'd be interesting to get your view on that as well.
Well, look, companies have adapted, but there's a limited amount you can do, right? I mean, obviously at the IEA, we've started to put more online because it's harder, it's been impossible to run bricks and mortar events. You can adapt that way. I'm not quite sure how you adapt if you're a restaurant or a pub. I mean, it's just, I suppose you can run a sort of takeaway service, but the nature of the lockdown for a vast swathe of businesses has been to make business impossible. I mean, you can't really adapt to that. You might just about be able to find one or two different things you can do to keep a part of your business going if you're, say, in the hospitality sector, but it's pretty difficult. So the nature of the lockdown, yes, of course, it's brought innovation to companies that can adapt, but that isn't sufficient. I mean, the fact that a pub can work out how to use Zoom doesn't actually allow it to serve drinks, right? And I think a lot of the traditional industries we want to get back as soon as lockdown ends and we can safely gather together again in pubs and music festivals and sporting venues up and down the country. But the problem is this: you can see the rationale behind the furlough scheme. So this was the idea that you could, if you like, temporarily make your workers redundant. You sort of say, well, look, given what's happened to the business, there's nothing for you to do in the months of April, May, June, or maybe half of July or a bit of August. And the government will pick up the tab for a reasonable chunk of your wages if you're paid around sort of £36,000 or less. That's the maximum they'll go to. And you can sort of see that. So that maybe that gets people through to August, September, October, when things are back to normal. And then we'll sort of split the sheep from the goats, and some restaurants will survive, many won't. Some pubs will survive, some won't. The problem is, when are we going to accept the guillotine of normality, if you see what I mean? So you mentioned the job retention scheme. The Wizard Wee's idea now is not just to extend the furlough scheme right the way through to October, which, by that stage, I really do hope that we have reverted to something approaching normal. It is true to say that the scheme tapers on the way to October. It becomes less generous and employers need to contribute more, but it's still pretty generous right the way through to October. But now employers are going to be given a £1,000 bonus or bounty if any of your furloughed workers are still in post at the end of January 2021. £1,000. Now let's think about that. That's about 2 weeks' salary for the average worker. So it's unlikely to weigh in the mind of your boss that this is going to be a permanent decision one way or another. If you're paying somebody £25,000 a year, you're unlikely to keep them on permanently if they're not viable just because you get a £1,000 bonus. But you might delay the decision. So rather than perhaps making this person redundant at Christmas, say, you'll now keep them on till the end of January 2021, because although they can't be wholly productive, Rishi Sunak's picking up, in the case of an average worker, half the salary bill. So it might be worth keeping them on. And then you let them go on the 1st of February. So I think that the consequence of this scheme, insofar as it makes people change their mind, and a lot of businesses won't change their mind at all, they'll just have to make people redundant, or they would have retained people anyway. Their furloughed workers would have returned to permanent positions anyway. But even in the narrow area where it makes a difference, businesses which are sort of umming and ahhing about whether to keep Bill or Fred or Tony or Jill on the payroll, it's probably only shifting a decision by a few weeks, that rather than this person being made unfortunately redundant in November or December, then they'll be made redundant on the 1st of February. And I think you can predict with some certainty there'll be a spike in unemployment on the 1st of February next year. Look, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we want to spread out the pain a bit. We don't want suddenly everybody who's going to be rendered unemployed to be rendered unemployed at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. There's a case for spreading it out, but I don't think it's doing much more than spreading it out. And therefore, the real big challenge is, what do you do to get these people back on their feet? How do you find them new jobs? How do you reallocate labour and capital to get the economy growing again? And it's pretty urgent that we turn our attention to that as we get back to something approaching normality.
Do you think that we were sold a lie by the government? We were told, or actually a lot of commentators were also making the point, that we could essentially put the economy into hibernation and then we'd have a V-shaped recovery or something very close to it. Do you now think that's looking like a fantasy? And do you think that a lot of people have been, well, we know that they were sheltered from the economic damage during the furlough scheme and will be up to October and maybe a little bit longer. But do you think that there may well be a backlash against that now?
Well, I don't know whether there'll be a backlash. I mean, I think, again, and I'm, you mentioned I was harsh in my article, and I like being harsh in criticising politicians when I think they got it a bit wrong. But I'm rather with the Institute for Fiscal Studies on the question of hibernation. I mean, kind of think of it this way. I think this is what the IFS were explaining. Imagine a kind of scenario in which you just put the economy into hibernation for a very short period of time, a mere matter of minutes. Assume there's a power cut across the country. Nobody can be productive for the 10 minutes that the power supply's down. Well, that would be a minor irritation. You'd effectively put the economy into some sort of hibernation for 10 minutes, but you'd bounce back from that in a minute 11. I mean, it's just a minor irritation. Now stretch that out a bit. Imagine you put the economy into hibernation for a day, a week, a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. I think each successive day corrodes the basic DNA of the economy. You can't put the economy in the deep freeze forever and expect it to spring back. Each successive minute of lockdown or hibernation is worse for the overall health of the economy than the previous minute. Most businesses could get through a day, a week, perhaps a month of not trading. But once that's extending to 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and once you're getting into, lockdown's only part ease, everybody's got to be socially distanced, everybody's got to wear a face mask, I need to spend a lot more on this sanitizer or these notices, then you're potentially causing very substantial damage to the economy. And that spring back, that zooming back becomes much, much harder. So the longer it goes on, the lockdown, there might be good health reasons for doing that. I'm just talking about the economic reasons. But the longer that lockdown goes on, the more you expect the journey back to be a crawl rather than a leap. And I fear that's what's going to happen. You're right, Emily, you've said that sort of the furlough scheme has shielded people from the economic damage. That indeed was its purpose, right? Rather than loads of people being thrown onto the welfare rolls over the spring and the summer. The aim was to shield that. But again, it only delays it. You can't just sort of fantastically pretend that everybody's going to be able to keep their job forevermore when we're effectively glossing over or Tipexing out the nature of the recession at the moment. So at some point that's going to bite. Maybe you want it to bite a little further down the line. Maybe it's sensible to delay it. But at some point it bites and it hits. And then the question is, well, what's your strategy now? Is it just going to be to continue to pay people very substantial welfare benefits? Or are you going to design economic policies that give the best wind behind and the best chance of getting people into new work? Because the displacement of labour is going to be colossal. And there's a danger at the moment that we're just leaning a bit too heavily towards, if you like, calcifying the present jobs, the present businesses, the present companies. I mean, Rishi Sunak's honest. He can't protect and keep alive every job. He knows he can't do that. But there's a danger that I think we're leaning too strongly in that direction, rather than asking ourselves, what sort of features and factors does the economy need to allow new jobs and new businesses to spring up in the months and years ahead?
Yeah, because there seems to be this rhetoric emerging, well, it's been around for a while, that it's up to the government to create jobs. I guess one of the main thrusts of your argument is that the Chancellor should not be picking winners, but should rather be, as you say, creating an environment that fosters private sector job growth. You say in your piece that this should be through focusing on tax reform, tax cuts, improving the regulatory environment for business. May I press you on the detail? What would you like to have seen from the Chancellor in that respect? Which tax cuts specifically and regulatory changes would you prioritise?
Well, let me start with the regulatory changes, because they are at least intellectually easier. You can potentially change, alter, reduce the regulatory burden for no cost or no outlay. It might require a bit of political will. It might even require spending a bit of political capital, but it doesn't require you spending any real financial capital. If you want to change the rules around occupational licensing, which I'll come back to in a minute, it's free. You just need to change the rules. I do accept that once you're into tax cuts, well, there are trade-offs here. We're going to have a colossal deficit this year. Are we also going to lower business rates, lower VAT, lower income tax, lower corporation tax? It'd be lovely to do all of those things, but if you like, they come at a price. That would probably, that would exacerbate, all things equal, the scale of the black hole in the government's finances. So let's start with the regulation. I would have liked to have seen the government do a lot more around making employment law considerably more flexible. We have extraordinarily in this country endless complex regimes about occupational licensing. What does occupational licensing mean? It means that you need a permit or a certificate or a qualification to carry out a particular job. And if you don't have that permit, certificate, or permission, you cannot carry out that job. Now, look, in some cases, that's going to make perfect sense, right? Neurosurgery, okay? You're going to want your brain surgeon to be a qualified brain surgeon. You don't want people just to say, well, last week I used to be a hairdresser, but I've decided to pick up a toolkit and reinvent myself as a neurosurgeon open for business this week. You can't do that on some highly sophisticated and dangerous jobs. But there are swathes of jobs in the United Kingdom where I think the occupational licensing, the permission you need to enter that profession is really just a barrier to entry. It's nothing to do with health or safety. It's nothing to do with making sure that we don't have completely unqualified neurosurgeons. I mean, one example, it's not a major industry in the United Kingdom, but farriers, and that's like, blacksmiths basically, right? If your job is to put hooves on a horse, you need a qualification that takes you 4 years to get. Now, I'm not suggesting there's going to be a massive upswing in horse riding or the blacksmith profession, but that's just an example of barriers to entry that make it harder for people to switch careers, switch professions, makes it a colossal investment. So occupational licensing is one area I would have liked to see a lot of change on. I suppose the other is planning reform. In fairness, the government's starting to take some steps in this area. As ever, you'd expect folk at the IEA to say, even if the steps are in the right direction, they're not fast enough or the stride isn't long enough. But I'd like to see a lot more to allow the redesignation of properties. Often when people talk about planning reform, they immediately think about the green belt and should we allow more building? And that is an important question. But let's just look at the stock of buildings we've got at the moment. There are far too many restrictions preventing them being put to new purposes. If you've got a factory that was engaged in enterprise X, I don't know, let's say printing, it's extremely difficult to just convert that print works to a nightclub or a hotel or residential property, for example. So that gums up the deployment of land and capital. So even if you're not going to lay down a single further brick in Britain or build a single new building, I think we need to make it much easier to switch building purposes, again, without going through this arduous process of filling in forms, getting permission from the council. That just calcifies the old economy. And if we're going to need a lot of change and a lot of reallocation, offices currently occupied by some companies that are going to go bust are going to need to be used for other purposes. Lots of people in the workforce are going to have to say goodbye to their jobs, or their jobs are going to say goodbye to them, and they're going to need to find new employers. All of that suggests to me you need to liberalise that process. On tax, I would like to see taxes go down if we can manage it. There's also going to have to be cuts on the spending side in order to make sure the deficit doesn't get out of control. But my broad approach there, without being too specific, because I'm not theological on the point, would be taxes across the board. So at the moment, Emily, you mentioned Rishi sort of picking winners. In fact, he's, if you like, deliberately picking losers. He's actually looking at the people who've lost the most out of the crisis, and he's trying to target specific tax cuts to them. And again, you can understand that. You can understand the rationale behind it. So there's a cut on VAT for the hospitality sector down to 5%. There's these £10 vouchers that you can use anywhere Monday, Tuesday or Wednesday for your pub lunch, although it can't be spent on alcohol. It can only be spent on the burger or the pizza. These are all ways of sort of helping the losers. But I would have preferred at least an indication that we were going to move to, let's say, reducing the VAT rate from 20% to 18% across the board, rather than making taxes ever more complicated. I don't know what the strict definition is of the hospitality sector, but It's not obvious where that line's drawn. So he's made the tax code even more complicated. So in changing taxes, I'd like to see broad brush approaches, reduce VAT by 1% across the board, abolish employers' national insurance contributions, at least for a year or two, cut corporation tax by another 1%, cut the basic rate of income tax by 1%, not cut the basic rate of income tax for hairdressers or decrease VAT for people who sell food. I mean, that gets far, far too complicated. That targeting, in my view, is not the route to the economy as a whole springing back.
That's quite interesting because obviously there have been other voices who've been saying that that targeted approach for the hospitality and leisure sector is the right one rather than a broad brush. So it's clear there's disagreement on that across the classical liberal economist world. I saw a tweet the other day, which was rather amusing, which gave a sort of overview about Sunak's strategy. It said, the way out of the coronavirus crisis is clear. Start your own loft insulation company, employ hundreds of young staff, only eat between Monday and Wednesday, and Sunak pays for absolutely everything. So with the insulation, he's talking about the Green Homes Grant, which has been given a price tag of about 2 billion, I think. The idea, as you mentioned in your article, is that this is a win-win policy, more jobs, fewer carbon emissions. Why do you believe this is a flawed assumption?
Well, I don't think, however intelligent, charming, and well-read our political leaders are, and Rishi Sunak is intelligent, well-read, and charming, that he knows the exact amount of loft insulation that is needed across the United Kingdom. I just don't think, for all of his high IQ, intelligence, research, and all of the efforts of his advisors around him, it is possible for him to conclude that the amount of loft insulation in the UK has fallen exactly £2 billion short of what is optimal. You just can't make those sort of central planning decisions intelligently. And there's very often these sort of government schemes that are presented as being win-win. Look, the government can create jobs. The government can employ people to dig holes and fill them in again if it really wants to. And those people can count themselves as being in the business of digging holes and filling them in again. You could even contract those jobs out to the private sector. If you want to run a company that employs people to dig holes and fill them in again, Rishi Sunak will give you a contract. But it's not, if you like, proper work. I mean, it's a welfare subsidy, essentially. So I think to a particular business, and just assume, because the word green is the adjective or prefix before it, that it's economically worthy of government investment is a misnomer. I mean, if this was done entirely for purposes of cutting CO2 emissions, that might be a different consideration. But this is a great job creation scheme, the loft insulation business. So that tweet that you referred to, Emily, I mean, obviously it said slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's kind of true that the government is strongly incentivising you to act in ways which the government deems are optimal, but aren't necessarily optimal for the wider economy. And I refer in my article to that famous story about Milton Friedman when he was in India and was bearing witness to a colossal government canal building project, and sort of said, well, why are all these men just building this canal using shovels? Why don't you actually use machinery and equipment and tractors? And he was put right by the chief engineer, who said, oh, you misunderstand. The point of this is in part to create jobs. It's not just to build the canal, it's to create jobs, Mr. Friedman. To which Friedman said, well, if it is just to create jobs, why don't we get them to build the canal only using spoons rather than shovels? Because that would take many workers much, much longer. And there's a danger, I think, the loft insulation scheme is in that same sort of camp. Yeah, we will get more loft insulation. Some people will make a lot of money out of it, but as a scheme to really supercharge the economy, there's no reason to believe that the market is under-providing boiler lagging at the moment.
Yeah, it's this. Well, a lot of these green schemes have been disasters in the past. Well, they haven't had the success that they said they would anyway. I wonder if you have the same attitude towards Sunak's strategy to help young people. Obviously, those coming out of school this year, those finishing up with university, are going to be facing an incredibly tough job market, arguably worse than after the financial crisis. We saw in May demand for labour hit the lowest point. And a study from the IPPR think tank estimated that an extra 620,000 people aged between 18 and 24 will be without a job by the end of the year. So Sunak's announced this $2 billion kickstart scheme, essentially with the aim of creating more jobs for young people. So we're going to be seeing the taxpayer essentially subsidising 6-month work placements for young people who would be on universal credit otherwise.
Yeah.
What do you think about this scheme?
Well, I mean, again, you can see the logic behind it, right? We want to help young people get, step up in the job market. But again, I think it rather misses the point and misses the target and is unlikely to be deployed, used and exploited in the objective sense in a sensible way. It is true that young people are going to be facing an extremely bad labour market in the months ahead. But that's true of everybody. I don't know why it's particularly true of young people. I mean, that's going to be true of people in their 30s, 40s and 50s who are made redundant. Why have we decided we're not going to provide special assistance to, women aged 50 to 55 on the grounds that they too are going to face a particularly hostile, non-benign labour market? So it's not obvious to me, and I'm not persuaded that the pinch or the bite on younger folk is necessarily disproportionate to the pinch and the bite on lots of other people, especially those who lose their jobs in the weeks and months to come. And my guess is that the scheme, and this is certainly true of these sort of schemes in the past, unfortunately doesn't lead to great job creation. The schemes can be used for what people are doing anyway. I mean, I've got half an eye on the IEA's interns program, Emily. We take on quite a lot of people for 6 months. If we were only taking them on for 5 months, maybe we should now extend it to 6 months. And Rishi Sunak will pay the bill. Well, why wouldn't the IEA do that? I don't think that leads to any guarantee that these interns are more likely to get a job at the end of the day. It just leads to an enhanced bill for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So again, I can see the intention, but I suspect, like most apprentice schemes and training schemes and all of the rest of them, you get an incredible deadweight loss. Most of the money doesn't actually end up generating great new jobs. Some of it might, but a vast proportion of it will be wasted. So again, I don't want to sound mean to young folk. They're facing a much tougher labour market than when I left university way back in the early 1990s, that's for sure. But it's not obvious that that's the particular sector, group or demographic we should be targeting more than any other. And again, if you had a much more broad brush, 30,000 feet view of the economy, you would generally make the economic environment more benign for businesses and companies, that they're having to do less to comply with arduous regulations left, right and centre, that they have a lower tax burden, and then it becomes easier for them to take on bright young people. That's the way, ultimately, over the long term, to solve it, I think, rather than these sort of schemes.
Yeah, just to finish up, to end on, what are you expecting from the autumn budget? We've seen that the Conservative, one of the Conservative Party think tanks, I think the Conservative Policy Forum, was sent out a snap poll to its members, asking them their views on wealth taxes versus income taxes and various other different forms of tax. Nowhere on that list were tax cuts. Are we going to be seeing tax rises in the medium to long term?
I think that's possible. I'm not wholly paranoid about it, because I think the truth of the matter is, one way or another, the government is squeezing about as much in tax revenue that it can get out of the private sector of the economy, almost whatever it does. In fact, there's an interesting historical evidence on this. If you look all the way back to the early 1960s, and since then we've had all sorts of different governments: Labour, Conservative, minority, majority, coalition, left of centre, right of centre, and all sorts of different tax mixes have been tried. A top rate of income tax of 83%, a top rate of income tax of 40%, VAT at all sorts of different rates. One thing remains unbelievably consistent, that no government of any stripe has ever found a way of extracting more than about 38 or 39% of national income in tax. Because if you start ramping it up too high, then people change their behaviour. Perhaps, there's a brain drain, or they retire early, or they reduce their working hours, or they go into some other profession that isn't taxed in the same fashion. So it's pretty hard for the government to squeeze much more out of the economy. The Taxpayers Alliance calculates the tax burden now is the highest in 50 years. And it's not just a choice for politicians if they want to dial that up a bit more. They can't just decide we'd like to double the amount of income tax we get next year. If you double the income tax rates, you sure as heck will not double the income tax revenues. So I think we've almost come up against the wall of the maximum amount of tax the government can credibly raise. I'm worried that they might try and raise more, and that they may fail, but in failing actually cause the economy a whole range of problems. And I think actually, although people are being asked, should we shift the burden? And I think that's an interesting debate, not just getting taxes down, but can we simplify taxes, or should we tax different things and shift the burden, off work and onto land ownership, for example. I think those arguments are interesting irrespective of the overall rate. But you know what, I'm a little bit more optimistic in the longer term. Although I've criticised Rishi Sunak for this sort of sticking plaster approach, well, it was kind of designed as a sticking plaster approach to get us through an emergency. And if his instincts really are in a kind of free market, pro-enterprise, buccaneering direction, then in the autumn, although I'm not expecting, glorious tax cuts, I hope that there'll be some prudence on government spending, an aim to get taxes down over the medium term, even if not this autumn, and most of all, a lot of supply side reform and deregulation, which he can do more or less for free if he's politically brave enough, because that could really kickstart the economy without driving a hole either through people's individual private finances or an even deeper hole into the public finances.
Well, thank you, Mark, on that relatively optimistic note. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And if you've been enjoying our daily content over the lockdown period, why not consider making a contribution? You can donate over on our website, iea.org.uk. Thanks for watching.